Boom. Hey everyone, welcome back to Scanline City. Today we are going to make a dedicated Sega Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive, arcade stick, using a pad hack technique. Now why would you want to do this? Well, because the period correct arcade sticks for the Sega Genesis honestly weren't very good, and there aren't any modern PCBs, that includes the retro board, that support the Sega Genesis. So I'm going to use the Real Arcade V7, which is actually a Virtua Fighter 2 arcade stick for the Sega Saturn. I think this is a perfect candidate because it only has 3 buttons and a start, which matches the Sega Genesis 3-button controller perfectly. You do have a couple options when it comes to the pad hack. Number 1 is an original Sega Genesis 3-button controller. You could also opt for the 6-button variant, but be sure to wire up that mode button because there are several games that require you pressing that for them to work properly. Number 2 is you could use a third-party controller. This one here is the PCB inside of the Hyperkin model you can buy cheap on Amazon. This is the one I suggest because the exposed solder points are easy to solder to. Lastly, and perhaps my favorite, is a 3-button reproduction PCB. I'll be making a separate video on this as there are some parts you need to order and some assembly required. Today we are going to use one of my defective 3-button Sega Genesis controllers, which will be perfect for my donor stick because it only has 3 buttons and a start. Okay, let's get started by taking off the back of the arcade stick. Snip the wire harness connecting the joystick to the PCB. Let's take out the joystick by removing those 4 screws. Remove the ball top by holding the bottom side of the shaft with a flathead screwdriver and unscrewing the ball with the opposite hand. The joystick should now be free, so remove that. Now let's take out the original PCB. We're going to use our soldering iron to heat up the 2 solder joints for each button, one at a time, while applying some prime pressure to the PCB. As those heat up, they should become loose and the whole thing should just pop out of place. You could also just remove the solder if you prefer. Clip that start button cable as close to the PCB as you can. I didn't clip it close enough, so I had to extend those wires later on. The original PCB and Saturn cable are now free, so go ahead and remove that. The buttons are now free as well, so pinch the side tabs and remove those. We're going to keep the stock start button, but you could replace that if you wanted to. Okay, now it's time for the messy part. We need to cut and flatten out the plastic in the joystick area. We're going to start by removing those 4 round standoffs in the square mounting area. I typically do the initial stages with various pliers and snips, just to get the main chunks out before moving to the Dremel, but you could just start with the Dremel if you want to. In addition to the standoffs, we're going to need to trim down those plastic walls on the left and the right of the square mounting area. We're also going to need to completely smooth out that circular plastic wall around the shaft hole. At the end of the day, we just need a nice, smooth area for our joystick to mount. You can see here the left and right walls have been trimmed down, and I went ahead and completely removed the wall where the joystick harness is going to connect. Next, I'm going to be trimming down this large circular platform near the top screw standoff. Technically, you could avoid this if you'd like to extend the wires so that the pad hack sits a bit lower, or if you're okay with just a tighter fit. Now for the joystick options. You have your Sanwa JLF and your Famitsu LS62. We're going to replace the stock shaft on this JLF with a short shaft variant you can order from numerous vendors. The LS62, however, already has a good shaft height for this mod. Regardless of which option you choose, you are going to need to shave down the shaft on the bottom side for extra clearance. We'll do that a bit later. Now let's go ahead and remove the top plate for the arcade stick. Remove the joystick mounting plate for whichever joystick you're going to use. Now put that plate on the arcade stick body and center it the best you can over the shaft hole. Now mark the mounting holes with a Sharpie. The Famitsu is a lot more forgiving because the mounting holes are a lot wider, but the JLF you need to be a lot more precise as the mounting holes are very close to the shaft hole. So when you go to countersink those holes, be very careful not to break into the shaft hole. Now it's time to countersink those holes, so you will need a countersink bit. The goal here is to countersink it just enough so that your screws are sitting flush or just below the plastic. I'm going to go ahead and drill out the patterns for both the Seimitsu and the Sanwa so I can show you both. Just to be safe, I suggest placing your screw in there as you go so you know the correct depth, and then you can just duplicate it on the other holes. Alright, so the arcade stick body is now prepped for mounting, so let's go ahead and modify the joystick shaft. To remove the shaft, you need to first remove the E-clip from the bottom side of the shaft using a flathead or a pair of pliers. Once you've done that, carefully remove the shaft because it is spring-loaded, and keep all the parts together. Now we're going to use a metal drill bit on our Dremel to shave down the bottom side of whichever shaft you're going to use. A good frame of reference is you need to shave it down to the point where there is no longer a flathead notch. Basically as thin as you can go while still holding the E-clip in. The shaft is done, so go ahead and place it back in your joystick. If you are going to use a JLF, you have one additional step. You need to clip the black plastic wings off of the side so that the mounting area is a nice square. Whichever joystick you are going to use, go ahead and mount it so that the joystick harness points out towards the right if you are looking at the back side of the stick. Go ahead and place your dust washer and screw down your ball top. Because we shaved down the shaft, we can no longer use a flathead to help tighten the ball top. So we need to use some pliers and perhaps a piece of rubber in between to clamp down on the top side of the shaft and tighten the ball top. That rubber in between the pliers should prevent it from getting scratched up. Let's go ahead and place the buttons we want to use. These are 30mm holes, so they should fit any Japanese button you want. That said, if you are going to use the screw-in type with the nut backing, you may need to trim a tiny bit of plastic above button C. With that, the stick is prepped, and it's time for us to work on our pad hack. Let's go ahead and open up our controller by removing those 5 screws and take out the PCB. There are several different types of PCBs when it comes to the OEM Genesis controllers. However, the process for identifying the signal and ground connections are the same. These PCBs are all common ground, meaning all the ground connections are connected together by their traces, like a daisy chain. So simply look for the connections that are daisy chained together, and those are your ground connections. The signal connections will be a single trace running from that button or direction to the center of the PCB. When in doubt, just use a multimeter with continuity to identify your common ground connections. Whatever is opposite of that is your signal connection. One thing to note is that some PCBs have a dark coating over the copper connection points, and in that case, you will need to lightly scrape off this coating to reveal the copper where the solder can bond to. Here you can see I've scraped off all the coating for all of my signal connection points. Now I just need to scrape off a single ground connection point because this is common ground. I'm going to choose to do this opposite of my start button signal point. We now have all of our solder points exposed, so let's go ahead and prep this PCB by adding a bit of solder to all of those copper connection points. Let's go ahead and get our joystick harness in place by connecting that to the joystick. We're going to use a daisy chain of ground wires, which you can get from multiple vendors. This will connect our A, B, and C buttons, but we are also going to snip a tail on each end of that chain. One end is going to connect to our ground from the joystick and the ground from our start button, so that's 3 wires together. And the other end is going to be soldered to the ground point of our PCB. For you experts out there, you can do this ground chain in many different ways. At the end of the day, as long as all of your ground connections of your buttons and your directions are connected together, and then you take one end of that chain and connect it to any ground point on your PCB, you're good to go. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and connect those 3 wires together that I mentioned, which is the joystick harness ground, the start ground, and the bottom side tail of our ground chain. I'll add a bit of solder and some electrical tape, so that's good to go. Now let's solder the other tail end of our ground chain to the ground point on our PCB. Remember, it's always easier if you tin both ends of a connection point before you put them together. And again, because this is a common ground PCB, this is the only ground point we are going to need to solder. While we're in the area, let's go ahead and connect the first signal wire from our start button. Now let's do the D-pad from the joystick harness wires. Follow the diagram to connect each wire to the corresponding signal point on the Genesis pad. Be sure to take notice if you are using a Sanwa or Seimitsu wire harness because the wire colors are in different order and they can be used on either joystick. Connect your right, down, left, and up. Now that the directions are done, let's go ahead and do the buttons. I got some wires here with some quick disconnects already attached. Each one I'll tin with some solder. Here's your A, B, and our C. With that, everything should be wired up. At this point, I like to flip over the PCB so it's upside down. Make sure no wires are getting pinched or stressed. The reason I place it so high on the stick is because I use the original cord stopper that came on the Genesis pad and place it in the slot where the cord stopper was on the original arcade stick. At this point, just screw on the back and let's test it out. And what do you know? It works. All right, so here I feel like I could make this a little bit better. I mean, the top panel's a little scratched up. I mean, I could replace that start button. Okay, fine, let's do it. Let's desolder the stock start button. I'm gonna Dremel that hole out a little bit wider so I can fit a new 24mm button. Let's go ahead and sand down this top panel, get rid of those scratches. And why not, let's go ahead and engrave it. Now that is more like it. That's pretty sweet. And look how good it looks next to a Sega Genesis console. That's what I'm talking about. I'll see you next time.